It was just 1 month ago, by a day or two anyway, that I sat at a picnic table in a Victoria Park to unbox the Nikon Z6III. I've used the camera regularly, if not exclusively, for a variety of shoots, so let's get to the results pronto, without too much introductory chatter. Later, I'll add an overview of stuff I like and don't like, rather than a technical deep dive, of which there's plenty online already. And I guess I feel compelled to respond to some of the controversy surrounding this camera or its semi-stacked sensor's dynamic range or lack thereof. But let's leave that for later and, as promised, show you some results that I've made since I got the camera on June 25th, both photo and video, because this camera has some excellent video specs. So let's get right to those, and if you stick around, I'll meet you back here for some thoughts on the camera itself. Hi, Ray here, back in the studio with the 25 megapixel Nikon Z6III. Now, there's been a lot of discussion surrounding the dynamic range of the Z6III, or lack thereof, and originally I had a lot of notes that I was going to use to add here. At this point, I feel like that's been beat to death, so I'll just talk about my experience so far. But, just to summarize, hang in there. Fellow Canadian Gerald Undone, I believe, started the discussion with his early tests, released on June 17th when the embargo on such things lifted, and he pegged dynamic range at around 10, just under actually, in the medium range, signal-to-noise ratio of 2, as he put it, clean stops that you'd actually want to use. A lot of people were initially waiting as well for photons to photos to weigh in. And thanks to William J. Claff, we have that data at our fingertips. He measures base ISO at 10.4 stops. But this is interesting. It looks like the semi-stacked sensor also is kind of dual gain with a jump at 800. So according to this data, at 400, you might as well jump to 800 for a slight advantage in dynamic range, assuming you're controlling such things. But I don't think it's useful to spend a lot of time analyzing these charts. I don't know about you, but I don't work in that world. When all's said and done, what are we talking about? Assuming these tests are accurate, and I'm not suggesting that they're not, but some people are agonizing over, a stop of dynamic range at some settings when it comes to video specifically, and that's what Gerald Undone was examining. Briefly again, because I don't want to get bogged down in this technical argument. He filmed what's called a Xyla 21 high dynamic range test chart run through IMATest program. So he shot varying flavors of NRAW on varying timelines, 6K, 4K, at a base ISO of 800 with and without noise reduction, and got 12 stops with noise reduction in post. Now, if we shoot 5.4K on a 4K 24p H.265, which is one of the settings that I was interested in and eager to use with this camera, then his results were in the medium range, signal to noise ratio of 2, again, clean stops you'd want to use, equaled 11.6 stops of dynamic range. And a better log curve than Nikon's might help, he concluded. And I'll examine an alternative in a future video. He noted noise improvement at ISO 6400 as well. For my use case, this works well, perfectly fine. We might forget that this is available in camera, but what this amounts to, ultimately, what it looks like on paper, is that there's maybe a slight cost in dynamic range with these fast readout stacked sensors in exchange for that readout. So no, the Z6III doesn't seem to have quite as much dynamic range as, say, the Z8 at certain ISO settings. Now, I happen to be old enough to have shot film over 3 decades, in fact, when professionals did everything that they could to squeeze the last ounce of dynamic range out of the film they were using from the film's characteristic curve. So after careful exposure, we used developing methods to exploit the full curve. In black and white especially, like for instance pushing or pulling the development time, water bath development to control shadows and highlights as the development progressed. When it came to unforgiving film like transparency, slides if you prefer, understanding exposure and how to use a light meter were pretty important. Kodachrome, for instance, the 64 and 200 ASA versions, had just 8 stops of dynamic range. ASA 25 was beautiful and had a dynamic range of 12 stops, but really it wasn't practical without a tripod or in very bright conditions. I see that recent tests were performed pitting modern cinema cameras like the Arri Alexa and Red against film cameras. And big surprise, the digital cinema cameras beat the film cameras hands down when it came to dynamic range. Not that film holdouts like Quentin Tarantino care, because professionals have never been hogtied by dynamic range. They know the tools that they work with, they know the limits within which they work, they know the palette, if you will, from which they paint, they understand lighting, and look, the semi-stacked sensor of the Z6III was, as I understand it, produced to answer some of the criticisms of the second generation Z6, like focusing. But Nikon absolutely would want to offer a lot more than the Z6 II. They'd shown in the flagship Z9 and its more affordable sibling, the Z8, what the X-Speed 7 processor could do. Then we got the retro futuristic ZF that is just a fabulous camera, albeit with a wee bit less in terms of video, as in just 4K, but beautiful H.265 10-bit nonetheless. In the Z6III, we get 6K up to 60p in NRAW and 30p in ProRes RAW, 5.4K up to 30p in ProRes 422HQ, 10-bit 60p in H.265, and so on, all of which is beautiful to my eye. And I should also mention 240p HD. A lot of choices to meet a wide variety of lighting and subject scenarios. I think a lot of the confusion comes in relation to exposing for video, especially when it comes to RAW and log footage, or HLG. Speaking for myself, I'm pretty lost without advanced exposure tools like waveforms and false color. Personally, I just wouldn't go out of the studio without a monitor that includes these tools. The waveform that Nikon has included in recent cameras from the Z9 forward, while helpful, it just doesn't cut it in challenging lighting conditions. And at the risk of repeating myself, it would be nice if Nikon could give us false color. After all, if Canon can do it, why not Nikon? I want to refer to a couple of my example images to illustrate practically what my experience has been with the Z6 III in the field. And then I'll get to more general likes and dislikes. Okay, I just want to talk about a couple of images that you saw earlier in the first gallery, shall we say. This one here of this cyclist, which I very much like. I just love the way he noticed me. This is shot with the Z6 III, of course, and the 85mm f1.2 Z-mount lens. Not a lens that I usually use for sport. I usually use zooms, but I wanted to try this out. I should mention that this is shot in the flat profile. That's the profile that I always use. So you can see here, the helmet is blown out and his face is in deep shadow, totally backlit. Sun is over here. You can see it's just poking through on the end of his nose. Anyway, quite a contrasty image that would help with high dynamic range. So let's get to my edit. This is my first edit. I'm quite happy with it though. And you can see we've recovered the helmet and the shadows look quite nice. You can see it's a very hot day. He's sweating and we've managed to pull his face up. Looks really good, I think. And you can see over here, I chose the profile camera portrait actually. I thought it worked well in terms of both what it did with the dynamic range and the skin tones. Now let's have a look at this image of the deer with his antlers all covered in felt. Once again, this deer was hiding under a tree from the hot sun. The background was obviously brightly lit. Love these grasses here. And this was a mixture of leaves sparkling in the sun and some patches of bare earth that were really bright. So what did I do with this? Well, let's take a look. First of all, again, this is shot in the flat profile. I changed to camera neutral and I did isolate the subject so that I could bring him up a bit. But the point here is, once again, very, very contrasty scene, dark subject. And let's just go back and take a look. That's how we started out. This is the second exposure, but I mean, I was shooting, I don't know, maybe 10 frames a second here, short little burst. And this is what I ended up with. So I hope that shows that the Nikon Z6 III has quite a bit of dynamic range, certainly enough for situations like this. My exposure is fairly good. I decided that I was confident I could bring those shadows up. That was my exposure, and that's what we ended up with. Okay, so after a month with the Z6 III, here's what I don't like about it. It's noisy. Not in terms of signal to noise, but compared to any of my other Z cameras, it makes a lot of weird sounds during operation. Even accessing the menu, it makes a kind of clunk. Same when it goes to sleep. It wakes me up. I'm guessing this has something to do with the IBIS lock. Now this isn't a real problem, only that it is noticeable compared to my other Z series cameras, like the ZF, which doesn't have IBIS lock. But a regular viewer also asked me about it. Contacted me because he was surprised how much noisier it is compared to his Z6 II. And my original Z6 is as quiet as a mouse in comparison to this camera. This strap split ring, I join a lot of other viewers in saying this is a design faux pas. It gets caught on the card door unless you have it strung on a strap, I should say. Even then it can get tangled. Clearance on the Z6, and I presume the Z6 II, is tight but completely functional. With the Z6 III, you have to learn a kind of new thumb flip trick to fully open the door. Luckily, I rarely use a strap. I use a video rig cage more often, so this comes off to accommodate and stabilize a cage. But I don't know how this made it by the design team, quite frankly. The flippy screen. I don't like flippy screens. I prefer the articulated screen of the Z9, then Z8. And I was disappointed with the choice to add the flippy screen to the ZF. And I feel the same about it on this camera. But that's just me. I admit occasionally in some circumstances it does come in handy. And I know a lot of people really like it. It's one of the reasons they're attracted to the camera. So stop whinging, Ray. One of my first video shoots with the Z6 III, the camera froze up. No, it was a really hot summer day. I mean, the camera refused to respond. I couldn't turn it off or perform any functions at all. I was using the ZF as camera 2, so I thought maybe I'd just have to shoot with it, shoot just 4K and accept a lot more jump cuts. I did consider driving back to the studio to pick up the Z8, but everything was set up and my wife, assistant, didn't want to stay behind alone in bear country. Luckily, this was just a YouTube video. Nonetheless, I was on a deadline for a promo in that video. And I'll now always carry a backup for the main camera, YouTube video or not. In the end, I pulled the battery, tried again, same result. Seemed to be a card issue. I was using the Novachip's 660GB Extreme CF Express Type B card, which has been performing flawlessly in my Z8 for almost 6 months. The Z6III apparently objects to that card. Now, I've come across at least one other Z6III owner who has had this freezing problem with another card. I switched to a 128GB Manfrotto card that I've used with no problems in several of my Z cameras, going on 2 years. Yes, I had a spare card and battery, and I switched out the battery for good measure, and the rest of the shoot went without problems. Started working again, it was fine. I'm going to do more tests on this compatibility issue, which hasn't happened with any other card that I've used in the camera. But here's a list of compatible cards from Nikon. The build quality is as robust as previous Z6s. It's what I'd call professional. No, it's not Z9 level, but the Z9 costs $5,500 US, 7,000 Canadian before taxes. But I expect that it will equal my original Z6s, which have withstood some rough weather and handling. Some of the things I've noticed and like. Once again, for my hands, Nikon absolutely hits it out of the ballpark for ergonomics. I love this slightly deeper grip. Not everyone will. In fact, at my original unboxing, I handed it to a photographer who was out scouting locations for a calendar shoot. And she immediately rejected the new design, saying, "I'll stick to my Z6. Fair enough. But that's the only complaint that I've heard about this new, slightly larger body. Larger than the original Z6, that is. The 2 function buttons, they're really well placed, no difference there. I've seen one reviewer go out of their way to make it look awkward to use the top mode dial. It's in the same position as the original, functions the same way as the last 2 iterations. It has this lock or unlock button, so you don't accidentally change settings. It's simple to operate. Mostly stays at M on my camera. So unless you're looking for something to criticize, I don't see it as any kind of an issue at all. My very first shots and video made with the Z6III on shipping day, I got mine on June the 25th. On that day, in very high contrast conditions. So contrasty that it pushed my Z8, used as the main camera, to its limits in video. But I was shooting 10-bit SDR, and yes, I might have shot in 12-bit RAW or at least used log. But my perspective is that of a photographer who also owns the Z9, Z8, and ZF. I view all these cameras as tools, and I try to choose the right tool for a given job. If I need the best in terms of burst speed, and yes, 20 frames per second RAW is good enough for me, then I'll pick up the Z9 or the Z8, and I'll choose the Z9, particularly when I want a vertical grip. Incidentally, the new MBN14 grip for the Z6III, $360 US, $480 Canadian, is also compatible with the Z6 II and Z7 II. So in summary, the Z6III is an excellent addition to my Z cameras. I appreciate the weight savings, especially when I'm hauling what amounts to a full studio setup into the forest. In future, for shoots like that, what I foresee is carrying the Z6III as my main camera. That 5.4K is awesome. Love it. The ZF, maybe as the second angle. Maybe even throw in a Z6 as a spare or even third angle. I haven't mentioned the new Nikon imaging cloud service. And that's used for imaging recipes, photo transfer, and firmware updates because I haven't used it yet. And I'll keep you updated if and when I do use it. The Z6III is a camera that just a few short years ago, would have been hailed as revolutionary. And it is, if you look at what it offers at this competitive price. Now, it's not chump change. I paid over $3,800 Canadian after tax. But again, dollar for dollar, I think it challenges other cameras in this class. The readout speed is very good. We've already seen the tests of swinging bats and speeding balls. So the electronic shutter is impressive. This assessment from me is based on just 1 month of regular use. And as I have with my original Z6, I'll be returning with updates. Recently, I added a 5 years with the original Z6. That was in April. But my first impressions of this camera are positive. Put this camera together with any of the superb Z-mount lenses, and well, it's in a league of its own. The Z glass is fantastic. I just love every one of my Z-mount lenses. Nikon keeps adding more options, and we have an ever-expanding choice from third-party brands. The future looks bright. Plenty of dynamic range in this camera if you choose to see the light. So if you found this video useful, please do give it the old thumbs up. And if this is your first time here, please do consider subscribing. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss more content from me. In the meantime, take care. Cheers. We'll see you later.